Standing up, she claimed she was tired and heading to bed. Yeah, tired from being unfaithful. I told her I would watch the news and join her
Hi
later.
mga
I
kamahalan
hadn't really
ko.
paid attention to the movie. My mind was occupied with plotting.
Sabihin kita sa
No one didn't do much until Monday. I endured the next few days, working on Sunday. On Monday, I called my broker handling my inheritance portfolio and had everything liquidated. Being in upper management allowed me to cash in 401k. On Thursday, I was ready to make money. We finished home and I was still in the I was only able to explaining that I would be flying out for 2 months. That was all I needed. When we moved into this house, I had stored everything important to me. None of it fit with her taste, so there was nothing else I desired. The furnishings were her choices, and frankly, I couldn't care less about them. The silver lining in this situation was that we were renting the house, so I had no financial investment behind it. Having recently sold my condo, we were in the process of finding the right house to buy. When I say right, I mean right according to her standards. So far, none of the houses we had looked at seemed to meet her criteria. On a Friday morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek one last time and carried my suitcases out the door. Loading them into my Lexus, I drove away without a single backward glance. My first stop was at an old buddy's place, Jake, whom I trusted implicitly. He was astonished when I proposed trading titles for his older but rebuilt four-wheel drive vehicle. Confiding in him about my situation, an hour later, I was headed west. I doubted anyone would connect me to this vehicle, and Jake promised to keep the car I traded him hidden in the garage for a while. For the next 4 days, I paid for everything in cash. I had canceled all our credit cards to avoid leaving a paper trail. The majority of my money was now safely tucked away in an offshore account, thanks to my broker. I had a system in place with him to arrange fund transfers when needed. I had enough cash in an SUV to last for a while. The nights alone in motels were the toughest. For the past week, I had been too occupied with executing my plan to reflect on what had happened to me personally. I had loved Janice. I wouldn't have married her if I hadn't. I played through various what-if scenarios in my mind, but ultimately, I concluded that there wasn't one I could have done differently. Even if I had known her old boyfriend had returned, I doubted I could have kept them apart. I arrived at two conclusions. She probably never truly loved me, and it was my own fault for being foolish enough to marry her. On the fifth day away from home, I found myself sitting in a mom-and-pop diner in a small town in Montana. I pondered what my supposedly loving wife was up to, as by now, she must have discovered that all her credit cards were canceled, and our bank account held no money. My thoughts were interrupted by an older couple at the next table, whose quiet conversation I couldn't help but overhear. A man, who appeared to be in his late 50s, was telling his red-haired wife about his wish for an extra hand on their farm. Unfortunately, they couldn't afford to hire anyone until their current staff was ready to the market. Even then, finding someone willing to work for what they could pay proved to be a challenge. Finishing the last bite of my meal, I stood up and approached their table, expressing my apologies to the traveler, and suggesting I might be able to help them. The older man scrutinized me, sizing me up. I don't see how you could do that. If you heard what we were talking about, you know I can't pay you anything. What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my labor? I can. His eyes narrowed. Colleen, excuse us for a moment while I speak to this young man outside, he said to his wife. Standing up, he waited for me to follow him. Once in the parking lot, where our conversation would remain private, he turned to face me. I estimated him to be about the rugged lines of years spent working outdoors. Who the hell are you? Are you part of that Wilson ranch? He asked with a hint of suspicion. I raised my hands defensively and said, "Hold on there, mister. I don't know anything about any Wilson. 4 days ago, I was living in Texas, and I just arrived here this morning. I thought maybe we could help each other out.
Pods is your personal moving and storage team who moves across town or across the country. Inside every Splenda product is a mission to help people live happier, healthier, and longer lives. But
He replied, "If what you say is true, why would you want to help us out? I can't afford to pay you. What's in it for you? If you're on the run from the law, we don't need that kind of trouble." I said, "I'm probably on the run, as you put it, but not like you may think." I proceeded to share my story about my unfaithful wife wanting to take me to the cleaners, and how I could use a place to stay for a while. I haven't robbed or killed anybody. I'm just trying to keep what's rightfully mine. If you have a place I could stay, I'll repay you with my labor. I'll pay my own way. And if you don't think I'm any help, tell me. I'll be honest with no hard feelings. He studied my face and said, "Son, if what you're telling me is the truth, I think I'd be a fool not to at least give you a shot. I have to tell you up front though, the Wilsons are trying to get me to sell my land to them. They haven't done anything underhanded yet, but I wouldn't put it past them. You might be biting off more than you can chew." I informed him that it was a risk I was willing to take. He then inquired about my ranching experience, and I was honest, admitting that I had spent a few summers on my uncle's place in Texas, but I wasn't a cowboy. He extended his hand, and we shook on our agreement. He suggested I call him by his first name, Bill, and I introduced myself. We walked back into the diner where Colleen awaited. He called out to her, "Colleen, this is Carson. He's going to be working for us if he can handle it." She stood and extended her hand. I shook it, and she greeted me warmly. "It's very nice to meet you, Carson." Her voice held a cool tone, with an Irish accent. Like her husband, she was trim, and I said, "It's nice to meet you too, Matt." She responded, "The last name is Buckman, but you just call me Colleen. Don't really have much use for formality in this part of the country." I instantly liked this gracious lady. Bill suggested we head back to the ranch. Before leaving town, he pulled up to a general store, and we both stepped out of our vehicles. He said I might want to pick up some clothes suitable for ranch work. Entering the store, he received a warm greeting from the owner, clearly a regular customer. 40 minutes later, I had enough jeans, work shirts, a coat, and a pair of Western-style riding boots for a week. It was sufficient for the time being. From the general store, it was about a 20-mile drive to the main gate, arched with the name Rocking Bee Ranch. That was Bill's brand name, Rocking Bee. Another mile of a private road led to the main house. Perched on a rise, their two-story house looked well-maintained and freshly painted. Behind it, a barn and several outbuildings came into view. The pickup they drove was partly loaded with sacks of groceries, indicating their weekly trip into town for supplies. I pulled up behind them, filled my arms with bags, and followed them into the kitchen. In 2 trips, we had the truck unloaded. Bill instructed me to drive around back, where he showed me a small cabin for my stay. As I pulled around, I saw him standing in front of the cabin. When I got out, he pointed to the cabin and mentioned that Sam used a similar one a few months ago, adding that Sam was out making rounds and I would meet him later. After unloading my bags, he waited while I settled into the cabin. It had a single large room with a bed along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a potbelly wood stove in one corner, and a bathroom with a single-store shower. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and served as a suitable place to stay for now, at least, allowing me to hopefully avoid being found by Janice. When I returned outside, he was sitting in his pickup and told me to hop in. He took me on a tour of the ranch, which covered almost 6,000 acres.
Oh my God.
5,000 acres were relatively flat and suitable for grazing, with a couple of 100 acres set aside for growing winter feed. The back section of the ranch, hilly and covered in forest, led to mountains with a stream flowing through the property, accessible only on horseback. He shared that he used to have 3 full-time hands, but Sam was the only one left after tough times. Sam had been working on the ranch for nearly 30 years. During roundups for selecting stock to take to market, they hired extra help. He dropped me off at the little cabin around 5 o'clock. By the way, I noticed you carry a laptop. I've got a satellite connection with a router so you can access the internet wirelessly. Supper is in the main house, and we normally eat at 6. He mentioned before driving away. In less than 30 minutes, I had settled in, leaving me time to boot up my computer. As he had mentioned, I was able to make a wireless connection, and I quickly checked for email. There was one message from Jake, stating that Janice had reported me missing to the police, and they were investigating my disappearance. It gave me something to ponder. Jake was the only one I had actually told about leaving, and even he didn't know where I was going. I had mailed my resignation to my former employer, but hadn't informed them in person about my departure. Just before 6, I walked over to the main house and knocked on the door. Bill called for me to come in, and as I stepped inside, I saw Colleen preparing food while Bill stood to the side, talking to a man I assumed was Sam. Bill motioned me over. Sam, this is Carson, the new hand I mentioned, at least for today. We'll see how he feels about it tomorrow after a day's work. Bill said with a broad grin, Carson, meet Sam. Sam gave me a warm smile and extended his hand. A big man, at least 6'3", he, like Bill, appeared to have worked hard throughout his life and seemed around the same age as Bill.
If you're making a to-do list today, make it easy on yourself. Just write down Reese's.
Very good to listen and reading English.
Write down, eat them. And then,
I'm interested in
I'm done for the
story.
day.
One notable detail, he was African American. I shook his hand, sensing the strength in his grip. Well, young man, let's hope you like it here. I could use the help, he said. At 28, I was about half his age, but he considered me young. I replied, I plan to give it my best shot. Just then, Colleen called us to sit down as supper was ready. Bill and his wife sat at opposite ends of the table, leaving Sam and me to sit between them across from each other. On the table were a large platter of pork chops, a big bowl of mashed potatoes, another with fresh green beans, and a plate stacked with obviously homemade biscuits. We don't eat fancy here, Carson, but there's plenty, and it's filling, Colleen said. It looks great, I replied. As we ate, I asked Bill if he had been here all his life, and his response was, yep. My grandfather started this ranch and passed it on to my father. Now it belongs to me and Colleen. Although when I was younger, I wasn't so sure she was going to be a part of it. I had to fight off every man to get her. He looked at his wife, and I could see the depth of his love for her in his eyes. She responded, now, Bill, you know you're the only man I ever had eyes for. I just had to make sure that you wanted me enough. Bill followed. My wife has been responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life. The day she agreed to marry me, the day she did marry me, and the day she gave birth to our daughter, Caitlin. I hadn't seen any sign of a daughter, and Colleen must have noticed my curious look and said, our daughter is away right now. She is finishing her doctorate's degree in veterinary sciences at South Dakota State University. She has only been able to get home for the holidays, and we are anxiously waiting for her to come back home with her degree. She's supposed to be home in a couple of months. Bill added, it'll be nice to have a vet in the family. Should cut down on some of the expenses. After dinner, I attempted to help clear the dishes, but Colleen insisted that it was her job and shooed me away. Bill mentioned that breakfast was at 5:30 and work would commence at 6. As Sam and I were leaving, I noticed a copy of today's New York Times on the counter, likely picked up by Bill in town. I asked if I could borrow the front page, and he agreed. Once outside, I asked him to step into my cabin for a moment. Inside, I took out my digital camera and showed him how to use it. I had him take a close-up of me holding up the front page of the newspaper. I could tell he was curious, but he didn't ask.
Pinalinis.
He did inquire about an alarm clock, and I assured him I had one. He said he would see me in the morning and left. I downloaded the picture to my computer and drafted it into an email along with a note to the police in my former hometown. The message stated that I was alive and well, and I had left town of my own free will. Choosing a national newspaper instead of a local one kept my location ambiguous. I sent the email to Jake and instructed him to use one of the local coffee shops with free internet access, as my work email would likely still be active. I provided my password so he could forward the original email and picture to the police without leaving any traceable paths. This way, I hope to avoid being listed on any FBI or national missing person lists, assuming the police wouldn't allocate extensive resources to search for a runaway husband. I slept soundly that night. The next morning, I was up at 5, showered, and dressed in time to walk with Sam to the main house. After eating, Bill instructed Sam to put me to work, replacing fence posts in the hilly section. Following Sam to the barn, he pointed out a horse and saddle I would need. He seemed satisfied with the way I saddled the big brown mare, drawing on my experience from my uncle's ranch. We then took 2 mules, attaching saddle packs to load fence posts and a post hole digger. Bill joined us at the barn, carrying a Winchester Model 94 in a saddle scabbard, explaining it was mainly for the rare occasion when we might need to put down a sick cow. Mounted up and leading a mule each, Sam and I headed out, following the creek up into the hills. As Sam and I rode, we engaged in conversation and got to know each other. I shared the story of how I ended up in Montana, trusting that he wouldn't betray my confidence. In return, he recounted his own experiences. He had married right after high school, only to discover his ex-wife in bed with another man. In a fit of rage, he had nearly beaten the guy to death, resulting in a 5-year prison sentence. Upon his release, Bill was the only one willing to give him a chance, and that was how he had spent the last 30 years here. Sam spoke highly of Bill and Colleen, considering them to be the salt of the earth. Half an hour later, we reached the fence, marking the property boundaries. Sam pointed out that not all the posts needed replacement, only those that had rotted or were close to it, approximately every third one.
I was 6 when Grandma Joan gave me this. Of course, she had no idea back then that 40 years on, I'd be leading a global team making it. Getting there wasn't easy. My team was serious in town, but as a business, we just didn't connect. Then?
He stayed with me while I replaced the first 2 to ensure I was doing it correctly. He suggested working until around 4, allowing me enough time to return, care for the horse and mules, and make it to dinner at 6. His parting advice was to follow the stream back down, ensuring I wouldn't get lost. He headed back, leaving me alone with my work. I progressed down the line, replacing old posts with new ones. At noon, I took a break and retrieved the pork chop sandwiches that Colleen had given me in the morning from my saddle rack. I finished my sandwiches and returned to work. My watch's alarm beat at 4 in the afternoon. I noticed that I had set all but a couple of the posts that the mules had carried up. Leading the mules, I traced back along the fence line until I found the stream and began descending. Just before leaving the trees, I discovered a natural pool where the stream flowed in and out. I stopped and admired the view, recognizing it as the most beautiful and serene spot on the ranch. Back at the barn, I managed to unsaddle the animals and get them fed in time. While I was tending to the horses, Sam entered to bed down his horse. We rushed to wash up and change before supper, where we enjoyed steaks that night. Exhausted, I made minimal contributions to the conversation and excused myself immediately after dinner
Yan,
to go to bed.
malaki siya.
Sleep came quickly and I slept deeply. When I woke up, I was sore all over. My hands ached from wielding the post hole digger and my arms, shoulders, and legs dry. Despite my regular workouts, there was a vast difference between a 2-hour gym session and a full day of setting fence posts. As I limped into the kitchen and winced while sitting down, I received a couple of chuckles from Bill and Sam. Even Colleen couldn't completely hide her grin. However, despite the soreness, I was ravenous and eagerly devoured my breakfast. Ready for another day of fencing? Bill asked as we rose from the table. I groaned and replied, "Yes, sir," hoping to sound more optimistic than I felt. Bill laughed. "I think you can give it a rest today. I'd like you to ride the rounds with Sam." I nodded appreciatively. The first task was to clean the stalls and replace the hay. After putting the horses and mules in the pasture and filling their feeder, we loaded up in the pickup and began our ranch inspection. Our primary goal was to ensure no cows were down or cows separated from their mothers. Sam's knowledge of the ranch seemed instinctual, and he effortlessly anticipated where the cattle would be and roughly estimated their numbers. After 30 years, it seemed to come naturally to him. As we reached the far end of the ranch, Sam stopped the truck and surveyed the surroundings. Something on one of the hills caught his attention, prompting him to hand me his binoculars and point to a specific spot. After a minute, I identified 2 cows seemingly alone. I inquired where their mothers are, and he gestured towards 2 cows near the tree line. "That's them over there. Their cows must have wandered into the trees, got lost, and kept going. We'll have to bring them down." I asked, "Are we hiking up there?" "Nah, it's too far. We'll go back and load up a couple of horses." The pickups were equipped with 2-way radios, and Sam called Bill, informing him of what we had seen and that we were on our way to get the horses. When we returned to the barn, Bill had already saddled 2 horses and loaded them into a trailer. All we had to do was stock up and go. Sam navigated us close to the tree line below where the calves were, and we unloaded the horses, riding up into the hills. Sam's 30 years on a ranch became evident once again as he knew the terrain like the back of his hand. Half a mile later, we eased up behind the calves and slowly began to push them back down the hills. I couldn't help but laugh when we cleared the trees and the wayward juveniles spotted their mothers. They ran, howling to their moms, and immediately sought out a tip to nurse on. The larger cows stood patiently, allowing their young to feed. It struck me how different it was from my childhood. That night's supper featured fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. With newfound energy, I talked more than the night before and learned more about Colleen. Her parents had immigrated to the United States from Ireland when she was 5 years old. Her father, fascinated by tales of the Old West, had brought the family to Montana, explaining the trace of Irish brogue in her speech. Growing up in America, she still retained the influence of her parents. Feeling much better the next day, I returned to replace fence posts after breakfast. Sam helped me load up the mules, but this time, I headed out on my own. Following the stream led me directly to my destination. This day proved to be easier than the first, as I had learned some tricks to make the work less stressful. Just before 4 o'clock, I set the last post and headed back to the barn. With some extra time, I whipped some of the stalls before cleaning up for dinner. On my 4th day, I assisted Sam in making repairs to some of the buildings, and the following day, I set more fence posts. The next 2 months flew by, and I now took my turn riding the ranch to check on the cattle. I was in the best shape of my life. We established a schedule where Sam took Saturdays off, Bill took off Sundays, and Mondays were my days off. I used my day to do laundry and run the cows if needed. I had grown quite fond of everyone on the ranch. Sam was good-natured and easygoing, and we often sat and talked after supper. I had a lot of respect for Bill, honest and hardworking. We got along well. Colleen was very sweet to Sam and me, but I could see she had some fire in her. Together, she and Bill made a great couple. Colleen and Bill were growing in studies. At breakfast on Friday, Colleen informed me that her daughter would be returning home in 1 week. It was my turn that day to take a horse and ride through the wooded section, checking for cattle that might have wandered into the hills.
This is very
With
nice.
my report, I made my way to the stream, turned to follow it down, and reached the pool below the water.
It moves the soft stone, something lunacy, the ceremonies and
I stopped, dismounted, took off my shirt, and knelt down next to the water. Dipping my bandana into the cool water, I began to wash the sweat and dust from my face and neck. A witty from downstream caught my attention, and I looked to my right to see a horse and rider approaching. At first, I thought it was Colleen, but quickly realized this was a younger version of her. This beautiful woman could only be Caitlin, with the same crystal blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She rode up and stopped several feet from me as I stood up and faced her. She asked in a cold tone, "Who are you? And what are you doing on this property?" I said, "The name's Carson, and I work here." She said, "I don't believe you. My dad said he couldn't afford to pay another hand." Despite her beauty, I was getting a little aggravated at her unfriendly tone, and I said, "Yeah, I heard that too." I guess that's why I laugh all the way to the bank every payday. She gazed at me, reined her horse around, and gave it a kick in the sides. I chuckled to myself, put my shirt back on, remounted my horse, and continued towards the barn. Later, I found out there had been a miscommunication between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she was coming home the next week. Instead, much to their surprise, she had arrived a couple of hours after I had ridden out. She had spent the morning and the early part of the afternoon with her parents until she expressed her desire to go for a ride, something she hadn't had time for in school but loved to do. So she saddled up and rode to her favorite spot, the waterfall and pool of water. I guess, after 2 months, I was old news and Bill and Colleen had forgotten to mention me. Just as I returned to the barn, I saw the back of the redhead disappear inside. I dismounted and proceeded to lead my horse inside. Caitlin must have been looking for her father and finally found him in the barn. I could clearly hear her loud voice as she asked, "Who is that man that was up at the waterfall?" Bill thought for a minute and said, "That must have been Carson." She added, "He said he works here, but last time I was here, you told me you couldn't afford to pay another hand." Bill followed. "Well, he's right. He does work here. As for what he gets paid, I don't think that's any of your business. I still run this ranch, young lady." She sputtered, "But he said you pay him so much that he laughs all the way to the bank." By that point, I had walked into the barn. She had her back to me and didn't see me, but Bill did. He gave me a grin and said, "Is that true, Carson? If you think you're overpaid, I can rectify that." She spun around and locked me in her lair. I pulled my hat off with one hand and scratched the back of my head with the other, and said, "Well, I would hate to take advantage of you, Bill. Just how much are you thinking of cutting my wages?" At that, Bill and I both cracked up laughing. She just continued to glare at both of us, failing to see the humor. "Sweetheart, just so you get that bee out of your bonnet, Carson gets to stay in the cabin next to Sam's," Bill said. She responded, "And what else?" Bill answered, "That, and he gets to eat your mother's fine cooking." Caitlin persisted, "So you're saying you aren't paying him? Why would he work for nothing?" Bill responded, "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to tell you." I then chipped in, "Working to have a chance to taste your mother's cooking is worth a lot, and I don't think she would like to hear you say that it's nothing." She shot me one more glare and stormed out of the barn. Bill shook his head and said, "She reminds me so much of her mother when she was young." I didn't think I would ever take Colleen. At supper that night, we were joined by Caitlin. She sat next to Sam on the opposite side of the table from me. She gave me another sharp look when I
Manang.
entered the kitchen. I waited until
Hey,
everyone
Manang,
had filled
Nancy.
their plates before speaking. I said in a pleasant voice, "Your mother tells me
Esda,
that
oh.
you have finished your doctorate in veterinary medicine." "Yeah," was her one-word answer, given without looking up. I continued, "Sam says that there is only one other vet
Manang.
in the area, and he's over 30
Manang
miles away.
Nancy.
I'm sure you're going to be a very big
Dako
asset
kayong
to us in this
isda.
area." She glanced up at my compliment, and I thought I saw her eyes soften a bit. "Yes, that would be Dr. Harrison.
Manang
He has
Nancy.
more business than he can handle, and is often needed in more than one place
Salmon
at the
ko,
same
oh.
time." Colleen then added, "I agree with you, Carson. Our
Maayong
Caitlin
buntag
will
po
be
din
able
na
to provide a great
manang.
service."
Habang
During the rest of the
nagkuan,
meal,
habang
Caitlin talked with her
naglinis ng
parents and
salmon
Sam,
live
who had been on the ranch since before
para
she was
sa
born. She didn't address me directly, and I, for the most part,
para sa
kept quiet.
ating
This was her homecoming, and I knew her parents and Sam wanted to hear what had been happening
ala
in her life while she was
7:11
away.
PM
As
manang.
soon as I finished eating,
Nanansi,
I returned to
7-Eleven.
my cabin and checked my email, seeing that I had one from Jake. He reported that he had
Para to
talked
sa
to a friend
tula.
of his on the police force and casually asked if they
Sinigang
still
na
considered him to
salmon.
be a missing person. His
Sarap
friend
oh.
said that everything had been dropped after they received the email with the picture
Apat
I
na
had sent
ulo.
them. As for Janice, Brandon had apparently dumped her as soon as he learned that he
Apat na
had
ulo ang
all
ating
along.
salmon.
It didn't look like Janice was going to get her hands on the suit. Of course,
Ah,
she couldn't afford the
okay.
rent of the
Narinig
house we
mo?
had been living in, and was now living in a city apartment, working as a waitress. She didn't have the money to hire a lawyer to pursue me. I
Tingnan
thought
ko
it
lang.
wrong. She had apparently only married me for my money, and her boyfriend had only wanted her for the same thing,
Kaya nga,
my money. I was still working
Wait
at
lang.
replacing fence posts,
tingnan
and
ko
I
muna
only did
manang.
so about every third or fourth day.
Kaya nga
I had
no,
moved out of
sayang
the
din.
hill
Kahit,
and was down where I
kahit,
could
kahit
drive
hindi
to
siya,
where I worked.
kahit
It
hindi
proved
siya,
easier to load the posts in the back of the truck
kahit
rather
hindi
than
siya
on wheels.
sounds, yung TV lang. Ay, I see. Hindi ko naman na,
Okay, dito yung spicy Washington.
hindi ko naman siya na naranasan ang TV.
Smart
The
Tinamot
morning
na lang
after Caitlin
niya.
returned home, I loaded the pickup with posts and
Hindi
drove
ko
to
alam
where I
kung
had
paano
left off.
imot.
When it was my normal time to take lunch, I started to the truck and
Mag-practice pa ako ng
realized
mot.
that I hadn't brought my lunch.
Sige, sige. Bye-bye,
If any
bye-bye.
of us were going
Sige, tingnan ko lang ha. Next time na lang.